Our next task then will be to create a function which will read the elements by their ID. And we looked at the HTML and we saw that elements had an ID. We also saw that they had a name, but we're going to use ID here. So let's create a function which is called read form data that accepts no values as input. So we're going to create our code, and we just do it straight after the array declaration. So we have read form data equals open round bracket, close round bracket. So that's saying this is a function and it doesn't take in any values. The input there is empty. And then we have this arrow function, and we have an open curly bracket, and then we have a close curly bracket. So that's the end of our method, our function. So what we'll do with this function then is I've just put in a blank line. Now when we do that, then we have a block of code, which is this function, but goes between the open curly brace and the closed curly brace. And within this function, we will read the data value from the inputs on the HTML page. So the HTML page is actually called the document. So it'll be document dot something when we use it. So for example, to read the value, we will use the ID of the HTML elements. So we will use get element by ID, but it will actually be document dot get element by ID, because it is the document, and that is really an interface that we use. So document dot get element by ID. So we will get the element by its ID, but we actually want the value that the person has typed into that, or that we have assigned to that particular element. So we then use a thing called dot value, which is a property. So document says that's the web page. Dot get element by ID, it has open round bracket and close round bracket. That means it's a function. So it gets the element by the ID, and then it takes the value from that. So a full example to read the vehicle registration number that we have on our web page would be document dot get element by ID, and then inside the open and close round brackets, we give the ID that we have used for that particular control, and it's inside double quotes. So it's called vehicle registration number. And then we want to get the value, so it's dot value. Now we will read most values from our web page or from our document using the ID and the get element by ID method, but it's not the only method that we could use. So we will read some of the values and assign them to variables that we have already created. So for example, vehicle registration equals document dot get element by ID vehicle registration number dot value. And then we do the same for the age of the vehicle. Then we do the same for the registration date of the vehicle. And then we do the same thing for the engine CC. So that is 4 variables that we have used, and we have assigned those the values that have been read back from the web page. So we will go into our code inside the function called read form data. We have assigned the values from whatever has been read. We have used the get element by ID method from the document interface. The document interface represents any web page loaded in the browser, and it serves as an entry point into the web page content. So we have seen that the get element by ID will find a particular element with an ID, but that is just one element on the web page or the document. And we say that the content of the web page is the DOM tree, or the document object model tree. And the diagram shows a very simple tree with a document at the top, which then includes HTML, and the HTML includes a head, and the head includes a title, and on the right hand side the HTML includes a body, and the body contains a H1 and a P, which is what we saw when we used the HTML. We then used the .value property to find a value that has been entered by the user, and then we assign the value to the variable, and we repeated the process for each of the elements. So we just do that for every element that we want. Now we will look at radio buttons to see which one, if any, has been checked. And radio buttons are slightly different because radio buttons mean that one can be on or off, but we can't have the 2 or the 3 radio buttons on. So radio buttons are really grouped, and therefore what we have is we have one of them. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to find the element by name rather than ID, because each one of them are different. So what we want is to get them by name. So when we want to find the element, we use the document.getElements by name, because each of the radio buttons will have the same name. Yeah, they might have different IDs, but they have the same name, and we're trying to find the group of these. And when we find the element by name, it actually puts it into the variable find element, which is an array, similar to the array we created earlier on. Because if there's 3 radio buttons, it will hold 3 things. If there's 4, it'll hold 4. If there's 2, it will hold 2. So we're trying to find all of those elements which are part of the standard specification. So let's go back into our code, and we will add the specification find element. So just straight after the code that we have written, we put in var find element equals document.getElement by name, and then we say standard specification. And you can see in this one I have used a single quote, whereas in the ones above we used a double quote. Either is acceptable. So now we will iterate the array of radio buttons. So we'll find the array by saying I want to find the element with a particular name, and there's going to be 2 or 3 depending on the number of buttons, and we want to then iterate. So we're going to iterate the find element, and how many times do we need to do that? Well, we don't need to worry. We just use the .length property of the array, and it will go, there's 2 of them, and it knows to stop, or if there's 3, it'll know to stop at 3. So for I equals 0 to I less than the number of elements, then I plus plus. So I want to iterate through and say, if the find element at position 0 is checked, then I want to say that this variable called standard specification is equal to the find element at position 0, but I want to get its value. We then go back up and we go to the next element and we go, if it is checked, then I want to set the standard specification variable to be its value. So once again, put the code in below where we have just added the other code. So this is just an iteration of the array that we find here. So the iteration here is of the array which is called find element, because that's what get elements by name does. It finds all the elements and puts them into an array, and then we iterate and see which one of them has been checked, because in the radio button group only one can be checked. We will now read the checkboxes that we have. We have 3 checkboxes, and all of them could be checked, or none of them could be checked, or only some of them can be checked. So we will look at each one individually. As we can see here, we're going to read the element with the ID of 500 excess, and we're going to see if it has been checked. And if it has been checked, then we're going to set the variable 500 excess to be equal to whatever the value is of this particular element, which we gave it a value when we did the HTML code. Else, if it's not checked, we just want the 500 access variable to be blank. And then we will repeat this for each of the checkboxes. So we will put the code in for this one first of all. So just after the iteration, the for the review button, we do the same thing here, but we're using if the document, whatever, get ID, if the document dot get element by ID 500 access is checked, then we set the value to be whatever has been put in. Otherwise, we set the value to be blank. So when we talk about the value, that is what was given in the HTML form. So when we look at the HTML form, then we can see that if we look at the 500 access, when we come down and have a look, then we can see that the value has been given as 500 space access. Or for the next one, it might be breakdown cover or car keys cover. We have assigned it a value. So when we read the value, it's not what the user put in. They just simply click the button, the checkbox, and we have the value which we then want to put to the back end or use in our quote. We need to do exactly the same for each of the other elements. So that was the first one, the first checkbox. Then we want to do the same for the second checkbox, which is the breakdown cover. And then we also want to do the same thing for the third one and the last checkbox. So you do for each one, let me just put the code for those two in. So we can see then that we have the first one, the 500 access, second one, the breakdown cover, and the third one, the car keys cover. So finally we will look at the last input, which is the text area. And the text area just allows the person to put in whatever information they want into the text box. So we locate the element with the ID of subject, and we get the value, and the value will be what they have typed in, and then we assign that to additional information. We shall put the code in for that. So additional information, which was the variable we set up at the very start, equals get the element by ID of subject and give me its value.